It's now 80 years since the end of the Second World War and the creation of the liberal world order, free trade, globally managed finance, commitment to international collaboration and foreign aid, and adhesion to common international norms. That included a commitment to liberal democracy as a target to which all states should aspire, however unevenly and slowly, embodied by the treaty obligations of every national signatory to the liberal European Union, very much a cornerstone of that liberal order. Today, confronted by so many challenges, the rise of Make America Great Again with the second election of Donald Trump and the accompanying dramatic increase of right-wing populist nationalism almost everywhere, including Europe, that post-war liberal order is in full retreat. A trade war is imminent. The Middle East and Ukraine are in turmoil. So grave and imminent are these threats that an increasing number of international specialists believe our framing should change from the post-war era to the emergence of a pre-war era. With me to discuss all this is one of Britain's leading observers of the international scene, and in particular Europe, Anand Menon, the director of UK in a Changing Europe. He is a dedicated social scientist, an approach that defines the think tank he leads, that provides impartial, evidence-based analysis and commentary across the gamut of issues that we face at home and abroad, and which will come under sharp relief as Donald Trump takes office on January the 20th. Welcome, Anand, to the We Society podcast. Before we plunge into these issues, your thoughts on this great pod, the We Society. Its name, what your first reflection is when we called you.
Well, firstly, thank you for having me. I'm always pleased to be invited to things. I'm particularly pleased to be invited to things that promote social science, because it seems to me that you and I have the same ultimate objective, which is to show that social science is not just a good thing in and of itself, but it can be actively useful to improving the world we live in. And I think, anyone who subscribes to that is a friend of mine.
Thank you for that. Are the post-war institutions that I described in the introduction so under threat that we should now talk less of a post-war period in our history, but more of a pre-war era?
I mean, I'd say several things to that. Firstly, we're always pre-war. We haven't abolished war. I think one of the problems we have is that we in Europe tend to rather glibly talk about the sort of stability of the Cold War, the lack of conflict. Loads of the world at any given point in time is burning. So the idea that, we are between wars is slightly fanciful. Just look at sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, to see that, so that's the first thing. Secondly, about the institutions, I think you're right up to a point. I mean, often these were commitments that were honoured in the breach. And of course, at the time many of these agreements were signed, lots of states in the world couldn't sign them for themselves because they were still colonies. So the aspiration was a great one. I'm slightly wary about sort of bigging Europe up too much in this, because for all its pretensions to be the sort of normative power, the liberal centre of world politics, we see what's going on within Europe at the moment. We have figures like Fico and Orban who are, well, let's put it politely, less than liberal. And B, quite often the European Union has managed to appear liberal by sort of exporting its illiberalism. I think in big, bold letters, I can recognise the picture you're painting, but as an academic, my first instinct is to pick holes.
It is slightly over-egging it, but there are folk in the States who say this, in the United States who say this, and here again in Europe, that actually we hope that there's enough vestigial commitment to that liberal order to people that hesitate before they go over the precipice. But actually, Donald Trump says tariffs are a beautiful word. He's not going to be anxious to commit big monies to defend Western interests if it involves putting at risk American troops. And I get that, but nonetheless, that's what the Americans have done since 1945. So you can see kind of where this is coming from.
No, absolutely. And, it is quite right and proper in some ways that people are chafing at a set of institutions and rules that were built, as you said, over 80 years ago. I mean, as someone of an Indian heritage, I frankly think it's balmy that the UN is structured as it is. So, in a sense, they were institutions.
India should be on the Security Council.
Yes, clearly. I have to say that just in case any of my family are listening to this. But I mean, in a way, the aspirations were right, but the structures of world politics are now fundamentally different. So it is right that we should question them. It is right whether we engage in a bit of soul searching as to whether or not the rules that we seek to uphold are rules that basically privileged us over other people. I think there's a good debate to be had about that, and that's exemplified in things like the debate over the climate crisis and who should be paying.
Yep.
When it comes to Trump, what I would say is one of the most annoying things about Donald Trump is there's often a kernel of truth to what he says. I think the last figures I saw, the United States were responsible for 68% of the defence spending in NATO. That's ridiculous. NATO serves to secure Western Europe. So the idea that the United States, which, yes, has a slightly bigger economy than the European Union, but not bigger than all of the European members of NATO put together, should be paying the bulk of that is slightly odd. I read the other day there was a piece by J.D. Vance in the FT a few months ago in which he was basically saying it's ridiculous.
The vice president.
Yeah, the now vice president, the then senator.
Elect to me, yeah.
Saying it's ridiculous that that the United States pays for Europe in this way. And I think, there's an element of truth in that. We in Europe have been free riders. One of the reasons we've been able to develop the generous welfare states we have is because the US have paid for security, and our security included in that. So, yes, the aspirations behind those institutions that buttress the liberal world order post-1945 are all well and good, but it doesn't mean they shouldn't be revisited a little bit now.
What about the European Union that's where you're kind of made your name, UK and a changing Europe. I mean, do you see that as a cornerstone of the liberal order that's kind of kept the world open, broadly safe, and broadly predictable, at least within, the North Atlantic?
I mean, to an extent, and certainly within Europe, I differentiate between two things, which is one, preserving the peace between East and West, where I don't think the EU played as great a role as NATO and the United States, for instance. But B, ensuring smooth transitions within Europe. I think the EU's role has been absolutely priceless. I mean, you wouldn't have put money, I don't think, in 1989 on the transition to democracy across Central and Eastern Europe and the Baltics going off smoothly and peacefully, given the number of territorial disputes there were between some of those countries, given the uncertainty that characterised those times. And the EU and its promise of membership and that progress towards enlargement was absolutely central, I think, to achieving a smooth, peaceful transition. So yes, the EU has played a role. I think we need to put that into context. One of the big problems with the European Union comes in its dealings with neighbours that do not want to join, whether that be North Africa, whether that be Turkey, whether that be indeed the United Kingdom. But the enlargement project is one of the great peace projects of our time.
Let's just go and drill into that a wee bit. I mean, countries like Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia have complicated relationships with Europe. They may not want to join they may be not want to join the full structures of the European Union, but they certainly want to be, part of the customs union, maybe part of the single market. They want access to its markets and they want access to its money. I mean, and if that means being in the sphere of influence, they'll buy it. I mean, much better for Europe that we accept that rather than they fall, say, into Chinese interest.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, absolutely. I think the danger of alienating neighbouring states has been all too evident in the case of Turkey, for instance, where part of that sort of dissatisfaction that led to Erdogan was this sense that they were being messed about by the European Union. I can't remember how many decades they've been membership candidates for, and it became increasingly clear that just wasn't going to happen. So, yeah, I would agree with you on that. I mean, there are issues around European integration, whether it is a peace project or a state-building project, because I think at the margins there are tensions between the two. State-building probably requires you to limit the spread geographically because otherwise the whole thing becomes ungovernable. As a peace project, you worry less about that and more about sort of bringing states within your ambit. And I think there's always been a little ambiguity between those two goals.
I talked to a leading German politician over the summer and was telling me that her concern was that Germany could no longer play the anchor role that it has played in the European Union. It's no longer got the economic strength to be the paymaster of the European Union, and that quite a lot of both the state building, and the peace project dimensions of the European Union that you described kind of do hang on Germany being prepared to kind of fork out much more than any other member state.
Yeah.
Now, of course, it can the euro and the EU gives it a defence. I mean, I've also heard people say that actually Donald Trump has not so much Europe in his sights, but Germany, because Germany runs a trade surplus with America. The rest of Europe doesn't. So, it's quite useful to the Germans to have Europe kind of as a buffer. But I mean, it's not going well, the German economy. Or should you never bet against the Germans?
Oh, I don't think this is a good moment to bet on the Germans because they've got really serious problems, some of which are of their own makings, the lack of investment in infrastructure over decades, for instance, but some of which are a function of this changing world we've been talking about. The shock of the Ukraine war and the need to wean yourself off dependence on Russian gas, what's happening with China, and I'm sure under President Trump there'll be increasing pressure on Germany not to trade so much with China. The German economic model is looking quite fragile.
So here we are. I mean, at a moment in time where, the dilemma facing the British government with the election of Donald Trump is he's going to put it firmly on the table, and indeed some of his aides have done that. So, Britain, if you want a free trade agreement with the United States of America, you're going to have to decisively repudiate the European Union, and you're going to get close to us. And actually, if you try and kind of shadow EU regulations, whatever it might be, we're going to call you out. And so, the idea of having your cake and eat it, of actually trying to have good relations simultaneously with both, that actually the UK has always wanted to do brutally. I mean, even inside or outside the European Union. It looks as though that is coming to an end.
There are several areas, I think, where we're going to face uncomfortable trade-offs. We're going to face trade-offs over security because if one part of the Trump administration's ask is not just that we spend more, that we spend it on American technology, that delays a time when Europe is less able to defend itself. If the Trump administration says you want to excuse the 20% blanket tariff, you have to align with our agricultural standards and allow our agricultural products in. And that is a direct choice we have to make between alignment with the EU or alignment with the United States. Now, interestingly enough, under this Labour government, not only have they ceased diverging in a way the Conservatives intended to in several areas, but they're passing a piece of legislation at the moment called the Product Safety and Metrology Bill, which allows...
Product Safety and...
Metrology.
Metrology.
Yes. I mean, I don't choose the titles of these things.
And that's about metrics and about...
It basically gives them the ability, using statutory instruments, to align with changing EU rules. And it's a piece of legislation that is fantastically important and isn't being discussed enough. It's there. It talks about, for those who are interested, UK and Changing Europe produced something called a divergence tracker, and the latest issue, which is out about now, talks about this in detail. Labour is showing signs of wanting to align with the European Union. Trump will challenge that, and there will be a difficult choice to be made. If, for instance, he says, well, look, if you want to continue with this special relationship in security, you're going to have to show a bit of willing on agriculture. That puts us in a really difficult spot because, our security institutions, whether it's intelligence, whether it's the military, cleave to that relationship with the United States. In economic terms, however, I think the relationship with the European Union is far more important.
Plainly, I mean, it's although the United States is our single biggest market
as a country,
it's trumped by, to coin a verb, by trade with the European Union. I mean, in talking to kind of off the record to leading members of the cabinet, they'd like not to have to make the choice. I mean, they'd like to keep lines open decisively to both kind of, and it's in our interest that we do. But I mean, if forced, they will go the European route, I think, and there's a lot of industry that would back them. I mean, for example, the chemical industry, pharmaceuticals and fertilizers. They don't want to have a kind of UK-only kind of regulatory kind of framework and then, a separate European one they have to also pay for. They want the common European one to apply to them and that to be the end of it. And there's a lot of industries that are in the same place, automobiles, for example.
I think we've got to be just a bit clear about that because people get this wrong sometimes. I think on the one hand, it is absolutely the case that businesses want one set of regulations, not two. So they want us to keep EU regulations just for the ease of having one set of rules to operate to. Just having the same rules as the EU doesn't get us access into the single market, though. There are still all the checks and paperwork and standards. That's a whole different barrel of beans, which requires going even further. The problem we have, I suppose, is Brexit has always involved some rather stark binaries that we've chosen quite often to ignore. And one of the binaries is you're either in the single market or you're outside the single market, because the EU says it's not going to give us bits of the single market. We can debate whether that's right or wrong. I think the EU's being a little bit overzealous, but there we go. And the real growth that we're missing out on is in the single market and the customs union. So when Rachel Reeves said in her Mansion House speech in November, Brexit is costing us money, we need to find a way to get closer to the European Union so that we can regain some of that lost growth, but we're not joining the single market and the customs union. That's essentially nonsensical, because the real economic gains are precisely within the customs union and the single market.
Just a short pause here to tell you about the Academy of Social Sciences, the organisation behind the We Society podcast. I'm Will Hutton, the president of the Academy of Social Sciences, and as I hope you know by now, we are a national body for academics, practitioners and learned societies in the social sciences. As president and host of this podcast, I know just how vital the social sciences are in our society. From education to government, business and finance, social scientists are at the forefront of tackling the most pressing issues of our time. And in this podcast, we bring you some of their best ideas to shape the way we live. You can find out more about the Academy of Social Sciences work, support us, or read up on our fellows by going to the website acss.org.uk. That's acss.org.uk. Now, back to the conversation. UK and a change in Europe. I mean, now you don't just look at Europe, you also look at internally into the United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. And one of your preoccupations recently in your recent reports has been just trying to get a handle on how this kind of diverse kind of ethnic population that we now have defines itself as British. And actually, you can either say the answers are kind of half full and there's some grounds for optimism that actually British ethnic minorities, including British Muslims, consider themselves more British. Or you can say the glass is half empty. Where are you in that?
Half full, I think. Half full in the sense that one of our findings, we just did this recent report on ethnic minority voters, is that in a sense, people are voting with their interest, not just their race. That's to say, it was always the case. It was a bit like the Red Wall. Ethnic minorities voted Labour because that's what they do. And partly they did it because Labour was seen as being a more reassuring party when it came to questions of race relations than the Conservatives. Now what we're finding is some segments of the ethnic minority population, particularly Indian Hindus and British Chinese, are increasingly starting to lean towards the Conservatives because, ironically enough, they're voting their economic interests, which is precisely what the white population is doing less and less. The white population, increasingly what you find is best, the more educated you are, the more likely you are to vote Labour. The less educated you are, the more likely you are to vote Conservative. It's exactly the opposite for Hindus and Chinese. And I find it encouraging that, you don't vote a certain way because you're an ethnic minority. You vote a certain way because these are my interests in this society, which is my own. So overall, and it's very unusual for me to say this, I'd say glass half full.
I was struck by the report because, it was interesting in that because it mirrors, in a sense, some of the observations about voting patterns in the States.
Yeah.
I mean, the Republicans are still a minority interest for ethnic minorities, but a growing proportion of ethnic minorities, Hispanics in particular, but also kind of Black American
Absolutely.
men in particular, young Black American, are voting Republican. And that actually the colour of your skin matters less and your ethnicity matters less than actually, what you perceive to be your class interest.
Yeah, and in general, I see this sort of unmooring, as I'd put it, as a really good... By unmooring, what I mean is, communities or groups that always voted a certain way just because they do. And, you could say exactly the same thing about the Red Wall. These people traditionally voted Labour, even though demographically they probably shouldn't have. Then they got unmoored under Theresa May and Boris Johnson and voted Conservative. And now their votes can't be taken for granted. And I think that, for me, is key, is that politics for far too long was able to take voters for granted because that lot will vote for us, that lot will vote for us. Why? Because they always have. That's no longer the case in this great age of volatility. So actually it means that politicians have to fight harder to persuade people to vote for them. I think that's actually a really good thing.
Yeah. Are there any potential reverses in this, or do you think it's just going to, that the trend that's been established is going to continue? I mean, is this just a kind of a short-lived upward blip, and there could be a regression
in terms of volatility per se?
In terms of how ethnic minorities define themselves, because the populist right are trying to say that you're not British. You may think yourself you're British, but actually, we don't think you are.
I mean, I have become concerned by the dangerous elision on the parts of some right-wing commentators of the idea of British and British-born. You'll say, a certain proportion of social housing is taken by people who weren't born here. I mean, my parents weren't born here. They both had British passports. They were British as far as I was concerned. I think we've got to be very, very careful about being sloppy with our language there. But no, I think this is a secular trend. I think it'll become more marked down the generations as well. I think one of the things we see is differences emerging between first, second and third generation immigrants. And I think this is a trend that is pretty much here to stay. And what will happen now is
you're second generation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, here you are, listeners should
in a cubbyhole in South East London.
Listeners should be forgiven. I'm not going to give away your age, Anand, but I mean, let's say just north of 50.
That's very kind.
Describe how that feels in relation to your own parents and how your kids feel about it.
So my parents arrived here in 1963. I was born here in 1965. In retrospect, my childhood was marked by a lot of racism, an awful lot. I grew up in West Yorkshire. I was the only non-white kid in my school. There was sort of persistent, teachers would call me Mowgli. There was a lot of that in my childhood. What I would say is my son's mum is white English, but he's never, as far as I can tell, experienced anything like race. It never even crosses his mind. I mean, he lives actually not far from here in central London, so maybe that's part of the explanation. But I think things have changed so much, and so much for the better in this country. It doesn't mean we should sort of relax. It doesn't mean we should take our eye off the ball. But I think we should pause every now and again and just think how much things have improved since those days of the 70s, where racism was just casual, it was ubiquitous, and it was just something you learned to live with.
This discussion has really been very wide-ranging. I mean, does that capture who you are?
I mean, so we're associated with Brexit, and obviously we're associated with Brexit because we were set up initially to talk about UK-EU relations. But my vision of UK and a changing Europe has always been non-subject specific in the sense that I see us as an amplifier of social science. That is to say, there are all sorts of people doing really interesting social science research in universities, most of which goes totally unnoticed because it ends up published in a journal that very few people read, and that's it. Then you move on to your next journal article. And I see us as fulfilling the role of taking that research that appears in a journal and talking to the author and saying, you know what, do us an 800-word blog, and on our site, it will get read by loads of people who aren't academics, and it might be that we can put you in touch with civil servants working in that area or pass it on to the media and maybe even get it published in a newspaper. So we're, if you like, a loudspeaker for social science, regardless of your area of specialism. Now, it's limited because there are other organisations that do this really well. Institute for Fiscal Studies does it for microeconomic policy. The Economics Observatory does far more of the economics than we do. But I see our role as being to publicise good social science research and convince people who aren't academics that this stuff is worthwhile and they can learn useful things from it.
What would you say was your what are you proudest of? What's the thing that you're proudest of?
Compared to when we started now, I think it has become far more of a knee-jerk reaction amongst journalists here to think, let's ring them and say if they've got any interesting research on this before they write a piece. We are inundated by journalists all the time saying, can you help us with A, B and C? And I think changing that reflex slightly has been a real achievement on our part. I'm also really proud of some of the young researchers we've had in our team, some of whom are still there, some of whom have gone on to bigger and better things. But just the
what
quality
could be bigger
of
and better than working for UK and changing Europe?
bigger and better in their misguided minds. Well, bigger and better in terms of salary, I have to admit.
What's your kind of sign-off message to our listeners?
Well, I suppose my sign-off message is, if you want to talk in an informed way about politics or economics, you can read the newspapers, but actually the best way to do it is to find social scientists who are willing to write for a non-academic audience and to learn from them, because these are people, believe me, who've done the work and who know their stuff.
So people like you.
Well, I write less and less, it has to be said. I just swan around doing podcasts, but there are some very good people there in the team who aren't me.
We started this with a slightly kind of, dark introduction about the kind of... I'm finishing it feeling a bit less dark.
Well, that's the first time anyone said that after a conversation with me, so excellent news.
I just feel that you're kind of, you're not... there's tensions, but we'll manage our way through them. That actually we'll find our way through.
Well, we may not. My bottom line is it's better to be informed than not be informed, and think through these issues, think about what lies behind them, and you'll come closer to solving them. And actually, the small part we play in that is trying to explain what the hell is going on.
Why a career in social science?
Interesting. My undergrad was in history, and I did a master's in international relations. And what I loved about it was the fact that history is your building block for something a bit more ambitious. So it was sort of being able to compare things or draw general conclusions. I remember a teacher of mine when I was doing my master's pointing out the difference between a book on the causes of wars by Michael Howard, the historian. So here are some individual wars, and these are what caused them, and the causes of war, which is what a social scientist would write about, which is to try and take the specific and to say, okay, are there any general factors here that we can think about? So in our conversation, for instance, we've talked about, the problems of populism in Western Europe. And there you can look beyond countries and draw useful comparative lessons about the common structural factors that we face, aging populations, rising social costs, and country-specific factors, over-centralised countries such as the UK versus decentralised countries like Germany, different electoral systems. And what I love about social science is that ability to speculate about broad things based on empirical evidence.
And you'll certainly be doing that this afternoon. Anand Menon, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. The We Society is brought to you by the Academy of Social Sciences, who can be found at acss.org.uk. I'm Will Hutton. The producer is Emily Finch, and it's a Whistledown production. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast, leave a comment, share with your colleagues and friends. Thank you so much for listening.